3 weeks ago, I found out everything I thought I knew about my life was complete BS. And honestly, I'm still processing how stupid I was to not see it coming. So I'm Derek, 28, been with Sherry for almost 3 years. We got engaged 6 months ago after I proposed at her favorite restaurant. Everything seemed perfect. She said yes, cried happy tears, the whole thing. Her family loved me. My parents adored her. We were planning this big wedding for next summer. The engagement party was at her parents' house last month. Nice place in the suburbs, big backyard, probably 80 people there. I was feeling good, you know? Proud to be marrying this woman, excited about our future. I'd been working extra hours at my job to save up for the honeymoon she wanted in Europe. I was inside getting another beer when I heard voices from the kitchen. The door was cracked, and I could see Sherry with her 3 bridesmaids and her mother clustered around the island, champagne glasses in hand. They were laughing about something. Mary, her maid of honor and college roommate, was talking about how pathetic I looked at my dad's funeral 2 years ago. She was imitating how I cried, making these exaggerated sobbing noises. The other girls were cracking up. Then Sherry joined in, talking about how I'm weak and how she'll dump me right after the honeymoon because I'm pathetic and she can't stand how needy I am. But here's the part that really got me. Her mother, sweet Mrs. Thompson, who always hugged me and called me son, was telling them how smart Sherry was because I'd already signed over the deed to my house as a wedding gift. Yeah, that house I bought 2 years ago and have been busting my ass to pay for. Apparently, I'm an idiot who already handed over everything I own. They were toasting to my complete humiliation at my own engagement party with people I trusted completely. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds just listening to them tear me apart. Mary was going on about how I'm a failure, just like my mother always said I was, which hurt because Mom and I had our issues, but she never called me that to outsiders. Sherry was agreeing with everything, adding details about how embarrassing I am in private. The weird part is I didn't feel shocked. I felt this cold clarity wash over me, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. All those times Sherry seemed distracted when I talked about our future, how she'd been pushing me to put her name on more accounts and documents for wedding planning purposes, how she'd been less affectionate lately but claimed it was wedding stress. I walked back outside and continued the party like nothing happened. Smiled, shook hands, accepted congratulations. Inside, I was already making mental lists of everything that needed to be undone. See, here's what they didn't know. I never actually signed over the house deed. I'd prepared the paperwork like she asked, but something felt off about the timing, so I'd been stalling. Good instincts, apparently, and most of our accounts were still separate despite her suggestions to combine everything. The party went on for another 3 hours. I played my part perfectly. Loving fiancé, grateful for all the support, excited for the future. Meanwhile, I was watching Sherry interact with everyone and seeing it all differently now. How she'd light up talking to people with money or connections. How she'd get this fake smile when talking to anyone she considered beneath her social status. When people started leaving, I helped clean up like always. Stacked chairs, collected plates, made conversation with her family. Her dad pulled me aside to talk about how happy he was to have me joining the family officially. I wondered if he knew what his wife and daughter were planning. That night after we got back to her apartment, Sherry was all over me, talking about how perfect the party was, how lucky we are, how she can't wait to be my wife. She was more affectionate than she'd been in weeks. I played along, but I was studying her face, trying to figure out how long she'd been planning this. We went to bed around midnight. She fell asleep immediately, probably exhausted from performing all day. I lay there staring at the ceiling, mind racing through everything I needed to do. First thing Monday morning, I called my lawyer. Not for divorce proceedings, obviously, but to review every document I'd signed recently and make sure nothing could be undone without my explicit consent. Turned out that house deed transfer she thought was complete never got filed because I'd never brought it to the courthouse. Smart move by past me. Then I started making some other calls. See, Sherry works at a marketing firm downtown, and her boss happens to be a guy I went to college with, James. We'd reconnected at a work happy hour she'd dragged me to months ago. Nice guy, very professional, takes his company's reputation seriously. I didn't tell James anything directly, but I did mention to him that I hoped Sherry's references had checked out thoroughly when they hired her. Just casual conversation, you know? He seemed confused and said they don't usually do extensive background checks for marketing positions. Why was I asking? I told him no reason, just curious about their hiring process. But I could see the wheels turning in his head. Wednesday night, Sherry came home upset. Apparently, James had called her into his office and asked some questions about her employment history that she couldn't answer well. Nothing major, she said, but it was weird and unexpected. I comforted her like a good fiancé should, made her dinner, listened to her vent, told her James was probably just having a bad day. Inside, I was satisfied that my subtle approach was working. See, the thing about Sherry is, She'd exaggerated her qualifications to get that job. I knew because she'd practiced her interview answers with me, and some of the experience she claimed to have was from internships that barely lasted a month. She'd been skating by on charm and connections, but if someone actually looked into her background thoroughly, there were gaps. By Friday, James had scheduled a follow-up meeting with Sherry for the next week. She was panicking, asking me if I thought she should look for another job preemptively. I told her she was being paranoid and that she should just be honest with James about any concerns. That weekend, we had dinner at her parents' house like we always did on Sundays. Same people who'd been talking about me like garbage 2 weeks earlier. Mrs. Thompson made my favorite meal and kept asking if I was feeling okay because I seemed quiet. I was fine, I told her. Just thinking about the future a lot lately. Sherry's sister Delilah was there with her husband Kyle. They'd gotten married last year in this huge wedding that cost her parents probably 50 grand. Delilah kept making comments about how excited she was for Sherry's wedding, how it was going to be even more beautiful than hers had been. I listened to all this wedding talk and realized they were spending money they expected to get back from my assets after Sherry divorced me. The venue deposits, the catering, the dress, all investments in a scam I was apparently funding. Monday morning, Sherry went to her meeting with James. She came home that afternoon pale and shaky. Turns out when you actually investigate someone's employment history, lies have a way of surfacing. James hadn't fired her yet, but he'd put her on probation pending a complete review of her work and credentials. She was crying, asking me what she was going to do if she lost her job right before our wedding. I held her and told her everything would work out somehow. But Tuesday morning, I got a text from her sister that changed everything. Delilah's message was panicked, all caps, asking me what I'd done to Sherry because she was at their parents' house screaming and throwing things and talking about how I'd ruined her life. Apparently, Sherry had figured out that her work problems weren't coincidental, and she was not handling it well. That's when I realized this was just the beginning. Update 1. You guys asked for an update, and honestly, I need to get this out because the last few days have been absolutely insane. So where I left off, Delilah had texted me that Sherry was at their parents' house, having a complete meltdown, screaming about how I'd ruined her life. I knew she'd figured out that her work problems weren't just bad luck. I drove over to the Thompson house around 7 that evening. I could hear shouting from inside before I even rang the doorbell. Mrs. Thompson answered, looking frazzled, and immediately started apologizing for whatever Sherry had told me, saying she was just stressed about work and wedding planning. Inside, Sherry was pacing around the living room with mascara streaked down her face, gesturing wildly while her dad sat on the couch looking completely lost. When she saw me, she stopped mid-sentence and just stared. I asked her what was wrong and if there was anything I could do to help. Real calm, concerned fiancé voice. That seemed to make her even more angry. She started yelling about how I'd deliberately sabotaged her job by talking to James behind her back, how I'd manipulated the situation to make her look incompetent, how she knew I'd done it on purpose to hurt her right before our wedding. I let her get it all out while her parents stood there looking mortified. Then I told her she was being paranoid, and that James was probably just doing routine employee evaluations. Why would I want to hurt her career when we were supposed to be building a life together? But Sherry wasn't buying it. She kept insisting that I'd somehow orchestrated everything and that there was no way it was coincidental. Her mother tried to calm her down, suggesting maybe we should all sit and talk this through like adults. That's when Sherry really lost it. She started screaming at her mother about how this was all her fault for encouraging her to string me along in the first place, about how she'd never wanted to marry someone so weak and pathetic, but everyone kept telling her I was stable and would take care of her financially. The room went completely silent. Her parents looked like they'd been slapped. Her dad asked what she meant about stringing me along, and she just kept digging herself deeper. She told them about how exhausting it was pretending to love me, how she'd been planning to divorce me after the honeymoon once she got access to my assets, how they'd all agreed this was the best way to secure her future. She was so angry and panicked that she was just spilling everything. Her mother tried to stop her, but Sherry turned on her, asking why she was acting surprised when she'd been the one suggesting ways to get me to sign over more property, about how they'd all been laughing about what a sucker I was at the engagement party. I just stood there letting her confess to everything while her parents realized I was hearing all of this for the first time, or at least they thought it was the first time. Her dad looked at me and started trying to explain that this wasn't what it sounded like, that Sherry was obviously having some kind of breakdown and wasn't thinking clearly. But I could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what it sounded like. I told them I needed some air and walked outside. About 10 minutes later, Mr. Thompson came out and found me sitting on their front steps. He sat down next to me and said he owed me an apology, that he'd had no idea his wife and daughter were planning anything like what Sherry had just described, that if it was true, it was completely unacceptable and not how he'd raised his daughter. I asked him directly if he thought I was weak and pathetic like Sherry had said. He looked genuinely shocked and told me that he'd always respected me, that I reminded him of himself at my age, working hard and trying to build something stable. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about everything. He told me that his wife had been pushing Sherry to settle down with someone financially secure, but he'd never imagined it went as far as planning a deliberate con. He said he'd always assumed Sherry genuinely cared about me. When we went back inside, Sherry had calmed down somewhat but was still insisting that I'd somehow set her up. Her mother was trying to convince her to apologize and explain that she hadn't meant what she'd said. But I'd heard enough. I told them I needed to think about everything and that maybe Sherry and I should take a break from wedding planning until we could figure out what was real and what wasn't. Sherry immediately started backtracking, saying she'd been stressed and had said things she didn't mean. That of course she loved me and wanted to marry me. She grabbed my hands and begged me not to make any hasty decisions over one argument. I looked right at her and asked if she'd really been planning to divorce me after the honeymoon. She swore that wasn't true, that she'd only said it because she was angry and wanted to hurt me the way I'd hurt her by sabotaging her job. So I asked her directly about the house deed she thought I'd signed over. Her face went pale, and she started stuttering about how that was just for practical reasons, to make sure she could handle things if something happened to me. Her parents were watching this exchange with growing horror. Her dad asked what house deed, and Sherry tried to change the subject, but I explained about all the documents she'd been pushing me to sign to put her name on my assets. That's when Mr. Thompson really got upset. He asked Sherry point blank if she'd been trying to trick me into signing over my property, and she couldn't give him a straight answer. The whole thing devolved into a massive family fight with Sherry screaming at everyone, her mother crying and trying to defend their conversations as just practical planning, and her dad demanding to know exactly what they'd been scheming. I left around 10 p.m. with everything unresolved. Sherry followed me out to my car begging me not to leave angry, promising we could work everything out if I just gave her a chance to explain properly. I told her we'd talk soon and drove home. But honestly, I was done talking. I'd heard everything I needed to hear. The next morning I called my bank and had them freeze all joint accounts pending further review. I contacted my lawyer and had him file paperwork to formally withdraw any pending property transfers. I changed my emergency contacts at work from Sherry to my brother who lives across town. By Thursday, Sherry was calling me constantly. She'd apparently been fired from her job after James completed his review and found discrepancies in her employment history. She was panicking about money and asking if she could move in with me temporarily since her lease was up at the end of the month. I told her I thought we should postpone the wedding until we worked through our issues. She immediately started crying and asking what issues, saying she'd explained everything and it was all just stress and misunderstandings. But I kept pressing her on specifics. About the conversations I'd overheard at the engagement party, about her real feelings toward me, about her actual plans for our marriage. Every time I brought up something concrete, she'd deflect or minimize it. She'd say I was misremembering things, or taking comments out of context, or that she'd been joking around with her friends. When I mentioned her mother's comments about me already signing everything over, Sherry claimed her mother had been confused in talking about the joint checking account we'd opened for wedding expenses. But I knew that wasn't true, and more importantly, I could see that she knew I knew. Friday night, she showed up at my house unannounced with takeout from my favorite restaurant. She'd done her hair and makeup and was wearing the dress I'd complimented her on when we first started dating. She apologized for everything and said she'd been thinking all week about how to make things right between us. That she realized she'd been taking me for granted and wanted to prove how much I meant to her. We ate dinner and talked about normal stuff. Work, friends, what shows we wanted to watch together. For a few hours, it almost felt like things could go back to how they used to be. But then she started talking about the wedding again, about how we shouldn't let one bad week derail all the plans we'd made, about how much money her parents had already spent on deposits and how disappointed everyone would be if we called it off. She suggested maybe we could move the timeline up and get married sooner, before any more stress could complicate things. Maybe even go to City Hall next week and have a small ceremony just for immediate family. That's when I realized she was still playing the same game, just with different tactics. I told her I thought we should call off the engagement entirely. Update 2. The last 2 weeks since I called off the engagement have been absolutely wild. I thought Sherry losing her job was dramatic, but that was nothing compared to what happened when I told her family we were done. So after I told Sherry I wanted to call off the engagement completely, she just sat there staring at me for like a full minute. Then she started laughing this really weird laugh and asked if I was serious or if this was some kind of test to see how much she loved me. I told her I was completely serious, that I couldn't marry someone who'd been planning to use me and then divorce me, that I'd lost all trust in her and couldn't see a way to get it back. That's when she switched tactics completely, started crying and begging, saying she'd never actually planned to divorce me, that she'd only said those things because she was scared and stressed. She kept insisting that deep down she really did love me and that we could work through this if I just gave her another chance. I asked her to leave and she refused. She planted herself on my couch and said she wasn't going anywhere until we figured this out. That 3 years together had to mean something and she wasn't going to let me throw it all away over a misunderstanding. I ended up going to my bedroom and letting her stay in the living room. Around midnight, I heard her on the phone with someone, probably her mother, crying and talking about how stubborn I was being and how she needed help convincing me to change my mind. Saturday morning, she was still there, had apparently slept on the couch. She'd made coffee and breakfast and was acting like everything was normal. Like if she just pretended hard enough, she could make the whole situation go away. I sat down and tried to have a rational conversation with her about why this wasn't working. I explained that it wasn't just what she'd said at her parents' house, but the pattern of behavior I was seeing, the pressure to sign documents, the way she'd talked about me behind my back, the whole scheme with her mother. But every time I brought up something specific, she had an excuse. The documents were just practical wedding planning. The comments to her friends were just venting frustration like everyone does. The stuff with her mother was taken out of context. She kept asking what she could do to prove that she really loved me, how she could show me that I'd misunderstood everything. She suggested couples counseling, or maybe taking a vacation together to reconnect, or even just going back to how things were before we got engaged. I told her the problem wasn't that I misunderstood anything. The problem was that I understood perfectly, and I didn't like what I saw. That's when she got angry again, started accusing me of being paranoid and looking for reasons to sabotage our relationship because I was scared of commitment. Said I was punishing her for being honest about her fears and insecurities. She brought up my dad's death and how I'd been different since then, more suspicious and closed off. Said she'd been patient with my trust issues, but that I was using them as an excuse to push away anyone who tried to get close. I asked her to leave again, and this time I was firm about it. Told her if she didn't go voluntarily, I'd call the police and report her for trespassing. She finally left around noon, but not before telling me that her parents expected me to come to Sunday dinner as usual to work this out like adults. That they were all worried about me and wanted to help fix whatever was going wrong in my head. I didn't go to Sunday dinner. Instead, I spent the day at my brother Kyle's place, filling him in on everything that had happened. Kyle was furious when he heard the full story. He'd always liked Sherry, but said he'd noticed she seemed more interested in my job prospects and financial situation than normal when they talked. Kyle offered to be there when I dealt with returning wedding gifts and canceling vendors. He also suggested I might want to change my locks in case Sherry had kept a spare key. Monday morning, Mrs. Thompson called me at work. She was crying and begging me to reconsider, saying that Sherry was heartbroken and barely eating, that everyone makes mistakes and says things they don't mean when they're stressed. I listened to her whole speech about how marriage requires forgiveness and compromise, and how I was throwing away something beautiful over hurt feelings. She kept emphasizing how much money they'd already spent on wedding preparations and how embarrassing it would be to cancel everything now. When she finished, I asked her directly if she really thought what they'd planned to do to me was just a mistake. If she honestly believed that plotting to take someone's assets and then divorce them was just normal wedding stress. She got quiet for a long time, then started crying harder. She said she'd never meant for things to go that far, that she just wanted Sherry to be financially secure and had given her bad advice, that she was ashamed of how everything had turned out. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but that this wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology, that the trust was completely broken and I couldn't pretend otherwise. Tuesday, Delilah started texting me constantly, long messages about how I was breaking up the family and how Sherry had been crying nonstop for days, about how everyone was worried and confused and didn't understand why I was being so unforgiving. She tried a different approach than her mother, focusing on how much Sherry needed me and how I was abandoning her when she was already struggling with losing her job. She kept saying that real love means sticking together through difficult times. I responded once, telling Delilah that real love also means not planning to scam your partner out of their life savings. She didn't text back after that. Wednesday, Sherry showed up at my office. Security called me down to the lobby where she was waiting with red eyes and a huge flower arrangement. She'd dressed up in the outfit she'd worn on our first date and had clearly put a lot of effort into looking perfect. She launched into this whole speech about how she'd been thinking all week and realized she'd made terrible mistakes, how she'd been so focused on practical concerns that she'd lost sight of what really mattered. She promised that if I took her back, she'd prove every day that she chose me for love, not money. The security guard was trying not to stare but was obviously listening to every word. Other people in the lobby were starting to notice the drama unfolding. I told Sherry we couldn't do this at my workplace and that she needed to leave. She asked when we could talk properly then, because she had so much she needed to say to make this right. I said I'd think about it and she finally left, but not before hugging me and whispering that she knew I still loved her and that we could fix this together. That afternoon, my boss James pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay. Apparently, word had gotten around about the lobby scene, and he was concerned it might affect my work. I assured him it was just personal drama that would be resolved soon. But it made me realize how far this was spiraling and how it was starting to impact other areas of my life. Thursday evening, Mr. Thompson showed up at my house. He looked exhausted and older than I'd ever seen him. He asked if we could talk man to man about the situation. We sat on my porch, and he told me he'd spent the week thinking about everything that had happened, that he was ashamed of his wife and daughter's behavior and didn't know how to fix it. He said he'd raised Sherry to be independent and strong, but somehow she'd learned to see relationships as transactions instead. He apologized for the whole family's role in what had happened and said he understood why I couldn't trust them anymore. But he also asked if there was any way I could find it in myself to give Sherry one more chance to prove she could change. I asked him if he really believed she could change, or if he was just trying to save face for the family. He was quiet for a long time before admitting that he wasn't sure. That he wanted to believe people could change, but that he was starting to see patterns in Sherry's behavior that went back years. How she'd always been calculating about relationships, even in high school. We talked until almost 10 p.m. By the end, I think he understood why I couldn't go back, even though it clearly broke his heart to lose what he'd thought was a future son-in-law. Friday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Sherry and a series of increasingly frantic voicemails. In the last one, she was sobbing and saying she was going to do something drastic if I didn't call her back immediately. I called Kyle instead and asked him to come over. We listened to the voicemails together and agreed they sounded more manipulative than genuinely dangerous. But Kyle said he'd drive by the Thompson house to check on the situation. He came back an hour later and reported that Sherry was fine, just sitting on her parents' front porch crying dramatically where the neighbors could see her. Classic attention-seeking behavior, not a real crisis. That's when I realized this was probably going to get worse before it got better. Final update. This is probably going to be my last update on this whole situation. And honestly, I'm glad to finally close this chapter. The past month has been exhausting, but I think I can finally say it's over. So, when I left off, Sherry was making those dramatic voicemails, and Kyle had confirmed she was just performing for the neighbors. I decided it was time to have one final, definitive conversation to end this once and for all. I texted her Sunday morning asking her to meet me at the coffee shop near her parents' house. Neutral territory where she couldn't create a scene or refuse to leave. She responded within minutes, saying she'd be there in an hour and that she was so grateful I was finally ready to work things out. When I arrived, she was already there, dressed up again and looking hopeful. She'd obviously spent time on her appearance and had that same forced brightness she'd been using since this all started. She launched into another speech before I could even sit down, talking about how much she'd missed me and how she'd been doing a lot of thinking about what really mattered. She said she'd realized that all the material stuff didn't mean anything compared to our relationship and that she was ready to prove that to me. I let her finish, then told her I was there to make things crystal clear, not to reconcile, that I'd decided to meet with her one last time so there wouldn't be any confusion about where I stood. Her face changed immediately. She asked what I meant, and I explained that I was completely done with our relationship, that I wasn't interested in working things out, going to counseling, or giving her another chance, that I'd seen who she really was and I couldn't unsee it. She started arguing immediately, saying I was being unreasonable and holding one bad moment against 3 years of good relationship, that everyone deserves forgiveness, and that I was throwing away something real over hurt pride. I asked her to be completely honest with me about one thing, whether she had ever actually loved me or if it had always been about financial security and what I could provide. She got this look on her face like I'd slapped her, started insisting that of course she loved me, that she wouldn't have spent 3 years with me if she didn't. But when I pressed her for specifics about what she loved about me as a person, apart from my stability and reliability, she struggled to answer. She talked about how comfortable she felt with me, how safe and secure our relationship was, how well we worked together as a team. But when I asked about personality traits or moments when she'd felt genuine affection, she kept circling back to practical things. That's when I realized she probably didn't even understand the difference between loving someone and appreciating what they could do for you. I told her I thought she was a fundamentally transactional person who saw relationships as business arrangements, that she probably wasn't even capable of the kind of love I wanted in a marriage. She got angry then, saying I was being cruel and judgmental, that I was acting like I was so much better than her when I was just scared of real adult relationships. She brought up my dad again, claiming I'd become cold and suspicious since he died, and that I was using that as an excuse to sabotage anything good in my life. I stood up to leave and she grabbed my arm, begging me not to walk away angry. She promised she could change, that she could learn to be the person I wanted her to be if I just gave her the chance. I told her that was exactly the problem, that she still didn't understand that love isn't something you perform or achieve through effort, that I didn't want her to become someone else. I wanted to be with someone who was already capable of genuine affection. She started crying then. Real tears this time, not the manipulative kind. She asked what she was supposed to do now, with no job and no fiancé, and her whole life plan falling apart. I said I was sorry she was in a difficult position, but that it wasn't my responsibility to fix her life or provide her with security she should be building for herself. She sat there staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Then she asked if I'd known all along what she was planning, if I'd deliberately set her up to fail. I told her the truth, that I'd overheard the conversation at the engagement party and had realized she was trying to scam me, that I'd taken steps to protect myself but that I hadn't set out to hurt her. She wanted to know what steps I'd taken, and I explained about protecting my assets and talking to James about her background. She got furious, saying I'd deliberately destroyed her life out of spite. I pointed out that I'd only protected what was mine, and that her employment problems came from her own dishonesty, not from anything I'd done to harm her. We went back and forth for another 20 minutes with her, alternating between begging me to reconsider and accusing me of being vindictive. But I could see she was finally starting to understand that I wasn't going to change my mind. When I got up to leave the second time, she didn't try to stop me, just asked if I'd ever really loved her, or if I'd just been using her too. I thought about it honestly and told her that I had loved who I thought she was, but that person had turned out to not really exist, that I'd been in love with an act she'd been performing. She asked what would happen to all the wedding plans and deposits, and I said that was between her and her parents, that I'd return any gifts that had already arrived, but the rest was their responsibility. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, it's been remarkably quiet. No more dramatic visits or phone calls. Kyle heard through a mutual friend that the Thompson family had to cancel the venue and lose most of their deposits, which was expensive and embarrassing for them socially. Apparently, Sherry moved back in with her parents and has been pretty depressed, but she's also started dating someone new already, a guy who works in finance that she met through Delilah. So I guess she bounced back faster than expected. Mr. Thompson sent me a text last week apologizing again for everything and saying he hoped I'd find someone who appreciated me properly. I appreciated that. My mom called me yesterday, asking why I hadn't mentioned breaking up with Sherry since she'd heard it through the neighborhood gossip network. When I explained what had happened, she said she'd always thought something felt off about how interested Sherry was in our family's financial situation, but she hadn't wanted to interfere. I asked why she hadn't said anything, and she said she'd figured I was smart enough to figure it out on my own eventually. Thanks for the confidence, Mom. Work has been normal again. James asked me once if everything had worked out okay and seemed relieved when I said yes. I think he felt bad about the whole situation with Sherry's employment, even though he'd just been doing his job. The weirdest part has been how much mental energy I have now that I'm not constantly trying to figure out what Sherry really meant or whether I was being paranoid about her motivations. I didn't realize how exhausting it had been to be in a relationship where I couldn't trust my own instincts. I've been spending more time with friends I'd neglected during the engagement period, and I started going to the gym again. Kyle says I seem more like myself than I have in months. A few people have asked if I'm dating yet, but honestly, I'm not in any rush. I want to take some time to think about what I actually want in a partner versus what I thought I was supposed to want. I do feel like I learned something important about myself through all this, that I'm stronger than I thought I was, and that I can trust my gut when something feels wrong. I spent so much time questioning whether I was being unfair or paranoid, but it turned out my instincts were right. Looking back, there were red flags I ignored because I wanted to believe in the relationship we were building together. But now I know that real love doesn't require that much effort to convince yourself it's genuine. Sherry texted me once more last week, just to say she hoped I was happy and that she was sorry things ended badly between us. It felt like closure, finally. I think she probably believes she really did love me in her own way, but her version of love was about finding someone who would take care of her problems and make her life easier. That's not what I want from a partnership. I want someone who chooses me for who I am, not for what I can provide. Someone who's building their own life that they want to share with me. Not someone looking for me to build their life for them. I'm in a good place now. Better than I was even before all this happened, honestly. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you end up teaching you exactly what you needed to learn.